Okay, welcome everybody. There's not too many of you, but we will proceed so that we can keep on track. I bet when you saw this book at the beginning of the year, you never thought we'd get to the end of it, but we have, and we're on the last learning unit, which is quite awesome. This learning unit's not in any of your assignments, so therefore I should think it will focus quite considerably in your end of year exams. Which is still a little way away. I know you're all busy focusing on your assignment at the moment, but this module, I'm sure, as I said, will come into your examinations. So please feel free to ask any questions. It's a really nice module on the healthy mind. It helps us look forward and take better care of ourselves. So it's a good module. This learning unit focuses sort of around three areas. One is around stress and how we cope with stress. The other one is around health and psychology and why the two are intertwined. And the third part of it is the really interesting section on positive psychology. So I hope you enjoy it. In the module, there's a lot, certainly in the textbook, there's a lot of research that's cited and quoted. So I'm not going to go into all of that research because it's all there for reading. But what I'm going to do is focus on some of the important principles that underlie this module. And once you understand those, the research that's described will make more sense, and you can go and do your own research as well on areas that interest you. So as per our learning units, these are the outcomes, is that obviously you need to know the key concepts and identify them in your own words. You need to be able to apply the relevant research. As I've discussed, there's quite a lot of research in this section that's cited to support these ideas. You need to explain why, according to the cognitive appraisal models, not everyone experiences change or disasters or stresses in the same way. We need to be able to look at the biological organs and systems involved in stress, the role of gender and the socioeconomic status, as well as epigenetics. We need to be able to identify various symptoms and effects of stress in examples, explain how we can manage stress, outline the concept of hardiness and how that might protect somebody from the negative effects of stress, and explain why the biopsychosocial model would also consider behaviors such as tobacco use, nutrition, alcohol, etc. in any health-related assessment, and then look at positive emotions, traits, and institutions that might play a role in healthy mindfulness, that is positive psychology. So those are the learning outcomes, and hopefully by the end of this module, you'll be able to understand what they are and tick them off that you can do all of those things. So the first part of the section is around stress and coping. I think we all experience stress a lot nowadays in modern living, more than our ancestors did back in the hunter-gatherer times. And so we first have to identify what stress is. And stress basically is an unpleasant emotional state that results from the perception of danger. So it's a perception, it's how we perceive a situation. And what that does to us, it demands that we have to exceed how we usually cope with something and find different coping capabilities. So its demand exceeds what we can normally cope with in our lives. That is stress. And when we look to understand stress, stress is very individualistic, which means that everybody experiences stress in different ways, different levels of stress, different things that they perceive as stresses. There's a very individualistic component to it. Not everybody experiences stress in the same way. It's also very powerful. It's a powerful adaptive response. So how we cope with something and how we cope with stress is incredibly powerful. It can impact so many other areas of our well-being. Although stress is unpleasant, stress can motivate us. So the thought of being stressed by an exam can motivate us to work harder. So as much as it's unpleasant, it can also act as a motivator. It can make us more pro-social. Pro-social means things like empathy, interacting with others around us. And social networks are an important factor in managing stress, and experiencing stress can engage those feelings in us. It can be counterproductive. As much as it can motivate us, it can also negatively influence. Therefore, it can be counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. It can contribute to psychological disorders. Stress is an underlying factor in a number of psychological disorders, things like anxiety, things like depression. Stress can contribute significantly to those disorders. And if we can't cope or adapt to a stressful situation, the outcomes can be negative. They can be negative in terms of our health. They can be negative in terms of our mental well-being. So stress has a significant impact across our lives. It certainly contributes to physical illness, and we'll see that later in the chapter earlier. So stressors or stressors are what actually causes stress. It's the source of stress, and everybody has different stressors. I don't know if you guys want to mention some of your stressors. They could be fears, they could be people, it could be a trigger for something. It's anything that causes stress in your life. The source of the stress is called the stressor. So Hans Selye, who sort of speaks a lot about stress, and his saying that he has that is really true, it's not the stress that actually kills us, but it's our reaction to it. So it could be a physical reaction or something emotionally or cognitively. So it's not actually the stress that kills us, but it's how we react to that stress. And the stress response, that's what it's called. So we have a stressor and we have the stress response, how we respond to it. And predominantly the stress response is focused around hormones and what the body does. So it releases epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, and that increases our heart rate. Remember, we spoke about the fight or flight syndrome, and it's that immediate response to stress. Your heart starts beating faster, your breathing gets more rapid, your blood pressure increases, there's a release of sugar from the liver, which gives you energy, and there's muscle tension. So once we experience stress, there's a stress response, which is the release of that particular hormone, which is also a neurotransmitter. There's also the release of cortisol, which it is when we get that stressed reaction, it's our body's alarm system, and that works with parts of our brain to control our mood and our motivation. So those are two very important hormones that when there's a stressor triggering us, the body starts to produce those, which has those physical reactions that we experience with stress. So Hans Selye built on the work of Walter Cannon, and what he did was he developed a model called the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS, which is basically, it's a cycle of a stress response. And when we experience stress, we can have a consistent pattern of behavior towards that stress, and stress can actually be long-term. So when stress is long-term, then all those hormones, the epinephrine and the cortisol, they're in your body at a lot higher levels for a lot longer period of time, and that is what can cause the physical response in your body, and that's where you start to experience physical illnesses. So when someone experiences a stressor, the first thing they have is an alarm reaction. That's the very first stage of it, and it's where that autonomic nervous system kicks in immediately as that stressor is perceived and identified. That alarm reaction clicks in, the autonomic nervous system kicks in. The resources in our body are mobilized for fight or flight, and we have that moment of mental clarity as that happens, and our physical response is heightened, our emotional response is heightened, and our mental response is heightened. And you can feel it. Last night I was eating a biscuit and I thought I'd broken a tooth, and in the space of about 10 seconds I felt my body react with such stress to that fear of having just broken a tooth that it was a very pronounced response. It was that alarm reaction. It was immediate and automatic. And as that stressor continues, if it's a longer term stressor that hangs around for a while, it means that our body starts to resist it. It strives to take care of ourselves, but at the same time, we're also aroused. And the stressor can actually impair our judgment as well, because that stressor is eating away at us, and it's a longer term reaction. So if one takes the meds that line through the phases, the shape would be more constant. Yeah, it probably would be. It would help you cope with stress a lot easier if you're on some kind of rescue or something. It would help your body's resistance. It would help fight that stressor. And no, I didn't break a tooth, thank goodness, but it's coming. I can feel that my tooth is not good, which is my resistance phase to the stress. And when stress is prolonged, your body gets exhausted. It can't cope with that continual elevated metabolic function. So that's around where trying to deal with stress is important, because you don't want to move into that phase where your body is just exhausted from having to cope with the stress. Your resistance to the stress is gone. You can't fight it anymore. And that's where it becomes dangerous to your health. Your strength and your energy drop to low levels. And that's where it now starts to have an impact on medical conditions, things like anxiety and depression and inflammation of various parts of the body. So your body moves through that cycle of sort of your alarm. The longest the stress lasts, you start to resist it, but eventually you can't anymore, and your body becomes exhausted, and you then become susceptible to other conditions. So the sources of stress, or the stressors, as I said, stress is a very individualistic phenomenon, and the actual stressor itself really does exist, as it says, in the eye of the beholder. It's how we perceive that stress. So what is discussed is what's called the cognitive appraisal model, and it's that immediate initial assessment of stress. It's rapid, it's initial. And do we perceive it to be an irrelevant stress or harmless? Is it a positive stress or a negative stress? And you feel that quite instantaneously is how your cognitions or your thinking appraises the danger of that particular stress. But you're also being individualistic. You appraise it from your own point of view. You look at your own strengths and weaknesses, and you determine how well or how able you are to cope with that. So you do have to dig deep and make some personal evaluations about your own strengths or weakness in order to be able to appraise that stress as something harmless, or whether it's a negative stress or a positive stress. It's appraised from our own internal point of view. And significant stressful events for most people, those big stressful moments can produce long-term generational effects. Things like mother and child. A significantly stressful event on a mother can actually have long-term effects on their children. So if their significant event is extremely stressful, it can be cross-generational, which is also a very long-lasting effect. So stress hormones can also cross the placenta, so that prenatal phase when the child is in vitro in the womb, those stress hormones of cortisol can go backwards and forwards across the placenta, and the research shows that if a mother is stressed during her pregnancy, it can result in children who are more responsive to stressful stimuli or even aggressive. So those sources of stress can actually come from those prenatal stages where the mother is experiencing stress. Stress can arise from disasters, and when we look at disasters, we talk about natural disasters or man-made disasters. So a natural disaster is something like a tsunami or an earthquake or something that's natural. A man-made disaster is something like terrorism. The example that they use in the literature is the impact that 9/11 has had on people. And also cross-generational impact. So disasters are a significant source of stress. Adult life events are a significant source of stress. What I've put on the right there is a stress scale that can be used where adult life events and looting, yes, are given a score of stress. So, for example, death of a spouse is a score of 100. That's probably the most significantly stressful event that somebody can go through, followed by divorce, separation, example, right down to the lowest stress. Well, it's not really low, it's a minor violation of the law. So throughout our adult life, we experience stressful events, and some are significantly more stressful than others. And even those little things we see in our everyday lives that we call hassles, it might be about queuing to renew your car license. It might be that you've lost your cell phone charger. It might be anything. Those small little things that are hassles, when they actually are all added together, accumulate to stress. So the sources of stress in our lives are multiple. And you know, compared to back in the hunter-gatherer days, as I said, there are more stresses in our lives, and the stresses actually hang around for a lot longer than they did back in those days. So our ability to cope with stress has to be understood, and it's something I think we have to all work on all of the time as to how we cope with the stress in our lives. So obviously, we spoke that there's a biological component to stress, and this speaks a lot to the areas in the brain that we did in our first semester. And within our body, that fight or flight response that kicks in when we experience something, an alarm goes off, and we have that coordinated reaction of physical, cognitive, and behavioral responses to danger. And our autonomic nervous system prepares us to fight something or flight. And when we see that stressor, there are neural pathways that this information travels. It's sensory information that travels through our visual senses into our thalamus, and then from the thalamus it moves into the amygdala, and I can't say that word, and I'm trying not to say it too often. And that is basically the center of the fear circuit in our body. And the information travels from the thalamus to this amygdala in our brains, which is part of our limbic system. And that part of our brain controls our autonomic responses associated with fear. It controls our emotional responses. It controls the processing and consolidation of memory, as well as the hormone secretions like cortisol. So if a stimuli is identified as dangerous, that part of our brain coordinates with our hypothalamus that commands the sympathetic part of the nervous system. And remember, when we spoke about it, that is an extremely fast response. It happens in milliseconds. And what that part of our brain also does, it allows us to be frightened by information that we also don't understand. So it might be something that we don't actually see in front of us that creates that fear. It might be a sense. There might be a sense that somebody's following you, or it might be how you interpret something. So our emotions are stimulated not just through a physical thing, but it could also be through a sense or a perception that we might have that something is about to cause a threat to us. So when we get the stress alarm system, there's two systems in our bodies that are mobilized from our brain, and one is called the sympathetic adrenal medullary system, or SAM, And that is where the adrenal glands, which are situated on top of our kidneys, release the hormones, and it releases adrenaline, which circulates into our body and into our bloodstream, and that's where we have that very short-lived fight or flight response. So that is that particular system that comes into being when we experience stress. The other system that comes into play is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA, and that's what communicates with the pituitary gland and releases the cortisol. So the SAM releases the adrenaline and the HPA releases the cortisol, and the cortisol boosts our available energy. And that system carries on for a lot longer. It's not as short-lived as the SAM. So that's when we have our chronic stress, is where this system is activated for a longer period of time. And our hippocampus in our brain works with a feedback loop, and it judges how much cortisol is in our body, and it secretes either more or it causes less secretion. And it's basically a feedback loop, and stress can impact on that feedback loop, which means our cortisol levels can be changed. And high and consistent cortisol levels can cause neuron damage. So longer term stress means a longer term response in terms of our HPA, which means cortisol is in our system for a lot longer at higher levels, which can cause damage. So those are sort of biological systems for managing stress, with those hormones that are involved in this particular process. We also need to know about gender and stress. And what the literature tells us and what research tells us is that women, instead of fight or flight, their go-to behavior is tend and befriend. So rather than fight or flight, they tend or befriend. And that's often, if you think about mothers with children, they tend to stay with their children or stay with their friends and tend to people. It's the nurturing and it's that caregiving instinct in women that makes us probably react not as quickly. We're more concerned about the people around us and the impact on them, rather than just fighting or flying. That could be, the research says, due to a release of oxytocin in this process, which promotes social bonding. So women are more nurturing, more caring. They don't react as significantly. They tend to approach it from a tend and befriend process. And obviously, socioeconomic status is very important on how we cope with stress. I call it the poor experience. So it's about poverty. It's about poverty's impact on health, as well as when you are coming from an area of inadequate resources and lack of money and all of those kinds of things that impact on your well-being. There are multiple stresses in our lives compared to people who are more socioeconomically higher or middle class or higher class. Those people who are experiencing poverty tend to experience a lot more stresses in multiple forms. And the epigenetics of stress. Remember, we discussed epigenetics back in the first semester, and that's about the gene and the environment interactions. So the two interact together, and that's why people also respond differently to stress. Different genes, different environments, different interactions. So we spoke about nurturing from the mother and how the mother influences genes responsible for producing and reacting to stress, and how they behave during stressful experiences. So nurturing from mothers can have an impact on genes and the genes responsible for working in the stress cycle. And the first 1,000 days, again, is very important. From the minute conception takes place to the minute the child is 2, is very important in how the child copes with chronic disease and life expectancy, which are all part of that stress cycle. Again, epigenetics has an influence on that HPA axis and its response to stress. And genes and life stress interact to produce major depressive disorder. So that interaction is very important, the concept of epigenetics. as well as the gene responsible for serotonin, and whether it's a long version or a short version of that particular gene can impact on life stress. So it really is around the interaction between genes, and the choices that are made has an impact on health, and that's epigenetics. So all of those different factors are really important when it comes to thinking about stress. So how does stress affect our health? And that's where our stress response, we spoke about whether it's a short-term stress or a long-term chronic stress. And as I said, modern living, there are more stresses, therefore there's more impact on long-term chronic stress. So one of those areas where especially the long-term chronic stress can have an impact on our health is with our immune system. Short-term stress doesn't impact on our immune system negatively. In fact, it can sometimes have a positive impact on our immune system. But long-term stress has a significant impact, and its main area is it decreases our immune system's response to things. So those lymphocytes or white blood cells which protect us from disease or viruses and things like that are suppressed, and that's what stress does. Social stresses produce the greatest impact on our immune system, and we'll see that the social environment that we're in is a significant contributor to stress, and that social environment has been shown to produce the greatest impact on the immune system in terms of stress. What stresses us also are things that are out of our control, that we have no control over. There's a significant impact on our immune system. And the older we get, and the other illnesses or comorbidities that we have can also impact on the impact of stress in our immune system. So one of the prominent causes of death is a suppressed immune system from stress. It makes you more susceptible to physiological diseases, medical conditions. And stress, we know, has an impact on heart disease. So the research has identified two different types of personality. There's a type A personality, is somebody who is competitive, time urgent, hostile, and aggressive. And a type B personality is somebody who's relaxed, more patient, and more easygoing. And the type A personality is the kind of personality who is more prone to being stressed because of the temperament that they have and the impact of that particular personality with heart disease. And the important part of that is the fact that they're hostile and aggressive. That has a significant impact on their social networks around them, that if you are a type of personality that is hostile and aggressive, you generally don't have strong social networks. And social networks are a very big preventative factor in stress. So when we experience stress, potentially it can lead to heart disease because those elevated levels of blood pressure puts our cardiovascular system at risk because of the ability of the blood vessels to cope with that increased blood flow. And so there's a significant impact on stress of those who already have cardiovascular disease. So you often hear people say, if somebody had a heart attack or something wrong with their cardiovascular system, they say they must rest and not experience any stress, keep their stress levels down, because their body can't cope with the physical reaction to a stressful situation. So that is stress and heart disease. Stress and mood and sleep and obesity, all of those things are intertwined. We know mood affects our sleep. Mood and sleep affect obesity. So none of those can really be considered in isolation. That stress can have a significant impact across all of those things because of their intertwined nature. So we know that sleep, and we did the sleep-wake cycle, and we looked at sleep and how essential it is for good health as well as our cognitive functioning. So the minute that our sleep cycle is disturbed, then we are also more prone to stress. Stress causes the increase in cortisol in our body, and cortisol has a role in maintaining those healthy sleep and wake cycles. So high levels of cortisol from stress can wake us up during the night, or can even prevent us from going to sleep. So the impact of having a bad night's sleep has a significant impact on other parts of our lives. Therefore, stress and sleep and the rest of those things are closely intertwined. And again, the depressed mood and cortisol affects our moods. And if we don't sleep well, we have the tendency to become depressed. If we're depressed, we don't sleep well, and stress has an impact on those. And also our appetite. Our appetite is also affected by our mood and our sleep. We don't eat as much, or we overeat because of stress, and sleep and depressed mood impact on appetite. So there's a whole intertwining there of all those different parts of our well-being, sleep and mood and appetite, that are impacted by stress, they're impacted by cortisol, and they're impacted by each other. So it's essential when we're stressed that we try to take good care of ourselves, make sure we do try to sleep, get enough sleep, because we all know that sleep is essential for good well-being. So again, on the right-hand side is how an individual sits in the greater environment around us. And stress is not experienced in a vacuum, okay? We sit as individuals in a series of systems. We sit as the individual in the middle. Around us is the microsystem that's made up of our home and our family and our neighborhood. The mesosystem is the schools, our workplace, and the things around us. The exosystem is around our parents, mass media, and the macrosystem is cultural beliefs and customs. So stress is not experienced in a vacuum, okay? And all of those different layers around us are really important because they protect us from stress. Protective factors are very important in stress. That's where your social networks are important, that you sit in the middle with a stressful response, but your home should be there to support you. Your school can support you. Your community can support you. Those social networking systems are very important. And it's an integrated view that somebody's not alone in this. There are systems there around them. Can also impact on them, but also they can act as protective factors. Your cultural, religious beliefs act as protective factors against stress. So how do we now? We are stressed. We have all of these hormones coursing through our body. So how do we cope with stress? We have to be able to manage stress. We have to be able to protect ourselves against stress. It's very important. So how do we manage stress around us? And I'm sure these are some strategies that you guys must use. They do actually become quite intrinsic in our everyday activities. How do we manage stress? Don't avoid stressful issues. Sometimes if you avoid an issue that's stressful, it gets bigger. So therefore, deal with the stressful issue to reduce the stress. Variables are out of our control, and we have to understand that. We have to understand that some things we have no control over. We have to learn how to deal with them. An internal locus of control means that you take responsibility for things. And by managing stress, by taking responsibility for the stress, it means that you are experiencing an internal locus of control. Regain control. It's all about responsibility. So take responsibility and regain control of your lives to manage stress. I'm sorry, this starts to sound like a self-help module, but it's not. It's all cognitive, and it's emotional, and it's behavioral as well. Good health. We spoke sleep and appetite and how we eat and nutrition. Maintain good health. Regular exercise is good for coping with stress. Practice mindfulness. Have strong social networks. Have a pet. Your religious and cultural practices can help you manage stress. So there are significant ways in your life that you can reduce the stress. Therefore, you can reduce the physical dangers associated with your response, for your physical response to those. So 3 types of coping with stress have been identified. The first, and each type of coping mechanism has got a positive and a negative component to it. So problem-focused coping means that you confront the problem head on. You're positive about it, you take it and you deal with it. The negative form of that is to avoid the problem. So focus on the problem, confront the problem, don't avoid the problem. We can cope emotionally. We have emotion-focused coping. So positive activities to reduce the emotional load. So go and exercise, go and run around the garden, but something that focuses on our emotions and emotion-focused coping. Negative to that is those activities that are negative activities for coping, like eating, like drinking, and dulling the stress through other means. And there's relationship-focused coping. So to be positive about that, it's about empathy, it's about support, and it's about sometimes compromising on things. Sometimes you can reduce the stress if it's in a relationship by compromising. The negative part of that of relationship coping is ignoring, blaming, and withdrawal. So there are different types of coping mechanisms, and each one of those you need to focus in on the positive approach to coping, not the negative approach to coping. And again, resilience. And resilience is a characteristic. And it's being able to be resilient to something, which means adapting to challenges in positive ways, which harnesses our inner strength to go on in positive ways. It means that we don't become the victims, okay? This is where we speak about hardiness, and hardiness is a trait. And it's made up of 3 pieces. It's made up of commitment, and commitment means that if you are committed, you see the world as interesting and you seek out the environment rather than withdraw from it. So consider yourself to be hardy. What does it mean to be hardy? It means to go out there and look for new things and don't withdraw from the environment. It means control. It means that we know that we have the ability to influence events. So to be hardy means that you commit and you take control, and also you challenge. So challenge means that you look for challenges, you see changes, and when you get a new environment, you look at opportunities in that environment, you look at opportunities for personal growth. So hardiness is very important in resilience, and it's about harnessing those different things together. And part of that is your cognitive skills, how you think about things. It's your social skills and your flexibility to new situations. And being resilient means that we build resources for emotional well-being. We are all incredibly resilient. And if we acknowledge that in ourselves and acknowledge those traits in ourselves, it goes some way to coping with the stress that we experience in life. So resilience is knowing that you are the only one that has the power and the responsibility to pick yourself up. And those are very significant factors when it comes to coping with stress. Don't sit back and be the victim and say, woe is me. Say, I am strong, I am resilient, I am hardy, and you find a way to cope with that situation. So then, what is the relationship then between psychology and health? So health now, the definition of health and good health is it's a state of complete, not just physical well-being, but health is around mental and social well-being as well. It's the whole picture. It's a biopsychosocial model. It's about the interaction between biology, which is that physical health, our genetic vulnerabilities, and all of those things that are within us physically. It's about the interaction with that, with our social environment, our peers, our family circumstances, our family relationships, as well as psychological well-being, coping skills, social skills, self-esteem, mental health. So therefore, the biopsychosocial model is how we now look at health. That is the link between psychology and health. And health now has a much broader definition than just our physical well-being. And predominantly because the causes of death have changed as our social situation has changed. Our socioeconomic statuses have changed. Everything has progressed around us. That those things that caused death a long time ago, that were basically sort of short-term conditions, little infectious diseases, they've changed. Things like pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis, the cause of death now has changed significantly to things like heart disease, cancer, lung disease, and strokes. And there's a significant interaction with behavior. And the focus has to be, and you've heard it many times, is around prevention. Prevention in our modern society has become very important. It's about prevention, it's about coping and recovery, as well as relationships with lifestyle factors. And the important thing here is a lot of our physical illnesses now are linked to behaviors, and behaviors are often choices, and choices and behaviors mean prevention. So the focus now has shifted very much into that preventative model. And again, that links back to what we spoke about with stress. It's about preventing stress. And if we can prevent things, we have a much better chance of survival. So specifically, when we look at this, let's look at examples of where psychology and health in that biopsychosocial model can actually come into play. It's about the impact of behaviors on our well-being. It's about a behavior as why would you start to do something when it's going to have a negative impact on your physical well-being? Why don't you stop doing that? Okay, and what impacts on our ability to make those choices and make those decisions. So nowadays, there are so many things that have an impact on our physical well-being that we can actually prevent. So tobacco, I'm not going to go into all of the research that's in the book. It's all there. We know that tobacco and smoking are a leading cause of death, and it's preventable. It's a preventable cause of death, and smoking can also affect non-smokers, and all the stats around smoking are there. So from a psychology and health perspective, it then says, why do people start smoking? When you know something can kill you, why do you start doing it? So often it's because you start smoking before your decision-making abilities are significantly mature in order to make that. It's a cognitive decision. Or cognitive immaturity, and you start doing something before you can actually see the long-term outcomes. Tobacco has an addictive nature to it. There are social pressures to smoke. People with psychological disorders tend to smoke more. In terms of giving up, it's not easy to give up smoking. The social nature of smoking doesn't support it. The stimuli, the conditioned stimuli stop you from quitting. And yet there are numerous strategies for quitting that involve cognitive therapy and things like that. So why start smoking? And if you start smoking, why can't you stop smoking? And there's the link to your health. Okay, it's a major cause of lung disease, and so many other things. Nutrition is a similar thing. Eating disorders are far more prevalent than they used to be. And remember, it's not just obesity, it's anorexia. And it's about that social environment is so critical in guiding our nutrition. Nowadays, our lifestyle is far more sedentary. We sit a lot more than we used to. We take in more calories. There's changes in the types of food we eat. The nutritional value, changes in our sleep patterns and our social factors affect our appetite. Impact in prenatal and childhood nutrition affects obesity. So it's about mothers and diets and children. So you prevent these things from happening. Poverty has a big impact on nutrition. The cost of healthy food. It's not cheap to eat healthy food. People eat food, cheap food that's often full of carbohydrates and fills us up. Therefore, it's not good for nutrition. We often measure ourselves according to those around us. If we live with someone who's obese, we also might tend to be more obese. Being able to change our behavior to lose weight. Why can't we do that? When we know something is bad for us, we know we're obese, we know we suffer or we're aware we suffer from an eating disorder, why can't we change our behavior? And our social networks around us are very important. So again, the link there between psychology and health is prevalent. Alcohol, same thing. We know the facts and figures around alcohol and alcohol usage, and people drink more, they start drinking younger, that it has an impact on the liver, it lowers lifespans, it causes accidents, and the risk of abuse and dependence. But again, that goes back to genetic risks for dependence. Socially, peer pressure and the operant conditioning, it reduces our anxiety. The more anxiety we experience, the more likely we are to drink or drink more. Stress, we drink to relieve our stress. So therefore, reduce your stress, reduce your alcohol intake. We get exposed to alcohol a lot more than we used to. We have children who are maltreated. The childhood environment people grow up in can lead to those children becoming alcoholics. And treatment is often difficult. It requires medical supervision. It's not that easy. So all of those factors around psychology have a significant impact on our physical well-being. Exercise. Again, exercise more. Sedentary lifestyles have become more prominent even with children. Exercise has enormous benefits. It has chemical release in our body. It releases many chemicals which have been shown to improve mood and reduce anxiety. Exercise helps with our concentration. Exercise helps us sleep better. Exercise can help us with our mindfulness. So even moderate activity, moderate exercise can offset physical health risks. And exercise benefits physical as well as psychological well-being. It can help with the treatment of major depressive disorders, can improve cognitive functioning, it can lower rates of infection. So that is a behavior, that is a choice. If we choose to exercise more, we can improve our physical health. Loneliness is, again, it's a trait in people, and it's also impacted with the social environment around us, a perceived deficit in social connectivity, which has an impact on psychological disorders as well as a contribution to mortality in older adults. And loneliness can produce risk of death along multiple pathways, which might be small, but they accumulate. So loneliness has impacts on us in small, little, significant ways, which cumulatively can impact on health. So again, social networks are really important. Older people tend to be more lonely, they lose spouses. So it's important to form social networks when you get older that can help combat loneliness and then have an impact on your well-being. There's an impact between culture and health. So again, across different countries, different cultures impact on health, they impact on life expectancy. Health is impacted by things like poverty, we discussed, discrimination, which is very cultural or racially bound, violence, access to resources is again to do with poverty. It's again to do with it's different across different socioeconomic statuses. It's about equity of resources, and it's also about how efficient those resources are. And I deviated slightly from the book here because the book really sort of looks at ethnicity and socioeconomic situations of ethnic minorities in the States. And, you know, again, in South Africa, we have, and it's not really written about much in our textbook, but we have a significant Africanization in our psychology, which means that in our culture and in our African culture, there are beliefs that can impact on physical well-being. The ancestors that speak through us can cause physical distress, physical illness, but that when you try to address it from a psychological point of view, you have to address it very differently. It's an Africanization in psychology rather than treatment with a sort of Western approach to psychology. The example I gave two pieces here that are research papers, and one is really interesting. It's on African my lights are going out here. I hope my internet sticks or flickering. And it's about understanding the cultural response to physical. And the one on the right is just an example, and it's around rituals and the belief that if certain rituals aren't adhered to in a Zulu culture, it can cause physical illness. The middle paragraph said a man in this particular instance was advised by traditional healer or Sangoma that his health was a direct result of his father's failure to Labola for his mother. So when we look at culture and health, there are so many components to that. Culture is beliefs that come down through generations, and culture has a very significant impact on our well-being, as well as socioeconomic status and racial discrimination and things like that around poverty and violence, exposure to violence. People in Afghanistan exactly at the moment, countries that experience warfare, very big impact on our health and our well-being. But I do encourage you that when you are working through a lot of these psychological issues, that you do think of them from a cultural perspective, especially studying South Africa, psychology in South Africa. It's a very big movement towards the correct approach to psychological treatment within an African context. Because remember, psychology was really developed in a Western situation by white, middle class or wealthy men, not much representation of women in those original theorists. And nowadays, we have to recognize the cultural response to psychology and well-being. Okay, the final section is on positive psychology. This is also a branch of psychology. And it's about the fact that it's not going to kill us. It's about how what we have to live with here. And traditional psychology, if you look on the little diagram in the top left-hand side, is basically dealing with people who are mentally unwell. So moving from an average level of functioning to dealing with mental illness. That's traditional psychology. Positive psychology moves you from a place where you're coping and you're managing to how can you actually flourish. It's about positive psychology. So the definition is the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. So it's about moving to that place of thriving. It's not about just the absence of stress or distress. And the field is founded on the belief that people we all want to lead meaningful and fulfilling lives, to cultivate what is best for us and to enhance our experiences of work, love, and play. So now we're thinking forward. We're not suffering from something, but we want to make ourselves better. And that is positive psychology. So it's built from the foundation of William James, who spoke about health and that it's not quite effortless, that you have to achieve that through effort. And more recently developed by a psychologist called Martin Seligman, where he looked at the scientific exploration of human potential, starting off with learned helplessness, which we learned about, and proposing that optimism, being optimistic about something or thinking positively about the future, can be learned. We can change our behaviors to allow for ourselves to flourish. And the pillars of positive psychology are built on three things. It's built on positive experiences, it's built on positive individual traits, as well as positive institutions. And those three hold up well. Come, move, next slide. Where have you gone? Oh, here we go. I think sometimes I don't resize my images, so sometimes they take a little while to load, which is not cool. Emotions, that is the first pillar of positive psychology. It's positive emotions and the experiences that produce. So the three pillars are positive emotions, that's the first thing. Positive traits is the second thing, and positive institutions is the third thing. Those three things combined are the pillars of positive psychology. So positive emotions, and remember, emotions are produced. I hope you're not losing audio. The lights did flicker. So if you can't hear me, just thank you. Let me know slightly. Thank you. Okay, the lights did flicker, but my internet looks a little bit weak, but I'm going to keep going, and I am recording. Sorry. Good-ish. I'll talk slowly. So, happiness. Happiness is the positive emotion. And there's gratitude, serenity, interest, hope, pride, all of those positive emotions. Positive emotions come from positive experiences. So happiness can be approached from two different perspectives. Hedonic, which means happiness is approached by getting pleasure from something and avoiding pain. That's how we're happy. We avoid pain and we seek pleasure. Hedonistic principles. You live a hedonistic life. You eat well, drink well, have a good social life, and we're all about experiencing those good things. Whereas eudaimonic happiness is a deeper level. It's about meaningfulness to ourselves and being able to self-actualize. And so those are different types of happiness. The first one is sort of fleeting, whereas the second one is longer and more meaningful. But again, happiness is transient. It doesn't stay static because our experiences and our circumstances change. So we're never always going to be happy. The hedonistic type of happiness comes and goes. Eudaimonic happiness, where we find meaningfulness, is longer lasting. But you can improve your happiness. Look within. For internal motivation to be happy rather than trying to source happiness from your environment. So it's about experiencing positive emotions and experiences that produce those positive emotions like happiness and what makes us happy. So we also need to think about the things that interfere with our happiness. So as much as we can be happy, things around us can impact on our happiness. Interpersonal relationships are a critical factor in happiness, as well as our social environment and its essential role in human behavior. So thinking about happiness, think about things that interfere with our happiness and find things that make us happier. So those things on the left are things that make us happier. Hate less, love more, worry less, dance more. Find those positive experiences that create happiness. Again, positive emotions, marriage. Marriage. Basically, married people are happier people. We hear the saying that they're not necessarily, but that is not everybody. And the research has told us that happier people are married, or married people are happier. They obviously are not as happy towards the end of their marriage as they were in the honeymoon phase at the beginning, but marriage is a factor in happiness. And a lot of that is to do with how your partner perceives you. Wealth and money. What is the impact of wealth, income and happiness over time? Impact of money on happiness. We know, we think that more money will make us happier, but research has shown that that is not necessarily the case. The more money we have fleetingly can make us happier, but over the long time, it does not increase our happiness. But at the same time, being happy can predict bigger increases in income. So if you're happy in your life, you can attract positivity, which can increase your sources of income. And remember that income is not necessarily monetary. It can also be social, psychological wealth, wealth in other areas of our lives, wealth around respect, being close to people, opportunities to learn, choices. Those are different kinds of wealth. Wealth doesn't necessarily have to be monetary. I'd rather be unhappy in a mansion. I think we all have that, but maybe when we get there and we start to experience it, we might be happier for a while, but there would still be things that would make us unhappy, and our general level of happiness might not change, is what research tells us, and the research is there. That's what we base this on. So then, just checking my slides to see if I've got more. Positive emotions increase happiness. Lost my track. Oh, there it is. Okay, so increasing happiness, we spoke about hedonic, which is obtaining pleasure and avoiding pain, and we spoke about eudaimonic, which is about meaningfulness and self-actualization. 3 types of happiness: the pleasant life, that's obtaining pleasure and avoiding pain. It's very moment to moment. And it actually scores the lowest in terms of a happy life. Those things are fleeting. They're not long-term. They're generally short-term. They're short-term wins in pleasure or wins through avoiding pain. My life is relatively pleasant, but it doesn't necessarily make you happy like other lives. The good life, to live a good life, eudaimonics, that's starting to look now at meaningfulness and self-actualization, maximizing our strengths. That is the good life. It's a step above a pleasant life. And it also speaks to the concept of flow, that we enjoy something so much, we're good at it, we get absorbed in it, in our task. We're living a good life. And the final life that you can lead is a meaningful life. We're participating in something much larger than ourselves. So maybe live a pleasant life, but we need to search for the good life and eventually for the meaningful life, because that is where happiness actually exists. So the second pillar of positive psychology is around positive traits. And we know that traits are those internal feelings that are in us, they're relatively stable and consistent. So what are positive traits? Yeah, the quote is nice. Just as the good life is something beyond the pleasant life, the meaningful life is beyond the good life. We have to get to having a meaningful life. So what are those positive traits? We've had positive emotions, we've had happiness, how to improve happiness. What are those traits in us that support positive psychology? Hope, hopefulness, being hopeful. What does that mean? It means expectation that a goal will be met in the future. Hope in us helps us withstand pain and stress, helps us solve problems better, enjoy stronger social networks. All of those things that are positive, hope triggers that. Resilience is a trait in us. We spoke about resilience. So as a trait, it can buffer against stress, and it can also lead to growth after a traumatic experience. You can be resilient, and that moment of resilience leads to personal growth. We see ourselves as survivors instead of victims. It increases our compassion and reduces the value of material things. All of those are positive elements of positive psychology. Spirituality is a strong trait. It helps us resist temptation and reduces need to engage in those risky and unhealthy behaviors that we can be exposed to, or they start to become part of our lives. So spirituality is a positive trait that links to positive psychology. And gratitude, the ability to be grateful, that trait of gratitude, feeling more positive emotions, relishing those good experiences, and being grateful for improving our health, dealing with adversity. It can help us build strong relationships. So we have emotions, but we have those positive traits that are different between everybody, but identifying them and maximizing them helps you lead a flourishing life, because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for being able to move from a life that is just being to a life that is flourishing and positive. And the final part of that is positive institutions. So that is where it moves away from sort of the self to things that are around you. And it's about institutions in your environment that enrich potential. It's around healthy families, around work environments, school environments, communities. Okay. Don't look at punishing, but support alternative behaviors that promote a positive approach to life. An example of this is a job, and it's how you see yourself in the workplace. Do you see yourself as doing a job? Do you just go to work to support your family? Work is an income, and that's all it is. Do you search for a career in your work environment? Do you search for a career? Is there an environment to fulfill the needs that you have for status and achievement and about advancing? Or do you have a calling, a fulfillment from the job itself? So being able to, in an institution, in a workplace, an institution around you, harness those positive things of finding something, finding a calling that is not just a career, it's more than a job, it's a calling, will impact on being able to flourish. A job is how you make money, a career is how you make your mark, a calling is how you acknowledge a higher vision, whatever it may be. So those three pillars of positive emotions, positive traits, and positive institutions can turn you into a flourishing individual. And I think positive psychology is something that we should all spend time engaging with and exploring some of those concepts and ideas. You know, it's even been taken one step further to now positive intelligence, and whereby we can actually improve our own mental fitness through harnessing those things that are positive within us and responding to life's challenges with a positive mindset rather than a negative mindset can actually create a positive intelligence. So that's also something you can investigate. That's also really interesting, is as much as you have an IQ and an EQ, you can also have a PQ, which is a positive intelligence score. And again, it's about thinking positive, being positive, recognizing what can bring us down, overcoming it, and working to be a successful self. So that's the end of the section on the healthy mind and being a healthy person. It is a really great topic. I love this topic too. It's so nice to get out of the drudge of the theories and actually find things that can have an impact on us and make us feel positive about ourselves. And you can all use this information even around your assignment submission, your exams, the rest of the month. It's a great chapter. So thank you for joining me. It's probably quite a nice way to move towards the end of the year. This is the last learning unit, but after we've written our assignment, what I will probably do is go back to revisit some of those topics where you need help and support, and I'd ask you guys, I'll send out a note and we can start to put some ideas together as to what you guys want to revisit in terms of what we think might be in the exam, areas where you're not sure of. We can revisit some of those areas, so we'll do that. I will send Kath the link to the slides and the recording. I'm just going to stop recording now.